One of the things I love doing when I'm traveling is watching people, just observing them, looking at how they interact. Maybe a family waiting for their flight, or perhaps some business associates hashing out their preparation for a meeting, or friends traveling together on a holiday. It goes without saying that life without relationships, I couldn't imagine what that would look like. Just seeing people interacting with one another and seeing how relationships enhance people's life, it's a really fascinating thing. So then, what are relationships? What are they all about? What really is God's purpose and heart for relationships? Welcome back to our channel here at Global Power of Faith. My name is Pastor Dennis. For those of you that are visiting for the first time, feel free to subscribe. That way you keep abreast of the videos as we release them. So this video really came about from a discussion we had last Sunday at church. Really invigorating discussion when we were looking at God's heart and purpose for relationships. Relationships are central to who we are. They are core to who we are as human beings. We were conceived within the context of relationships. That's how we got our life. And literally our life was sustained in those early years through that relationship that we had with Mum. Without that relationship, we would not exist. And relationships will carry on being a really fundamental part of who we are right up until the grave and beyond. Relationships are a source of immense blessing to us. In fact, I believe one of the fundamental things they do is they impart life to our very being. And consequently, that same door, that same avenue has the potential to wreak real havoc and pain and even destruction to who we are, to our very personhood. I was recounting to our church last Sunday an incident that happened when I was a child, and it's an incident I must say I'm not very proud of. When I was very angry with my sister, and she had come home with some homework. They were requested to make a clay pot, as part of this project. I think it was part of her lesson on African art. And after she'd made this clay pot, in a moment of real rage, I went and destroyed this pot. And bless her, my sister just patiently forgave me, and she set about the business of restoring this pot. And I thought that is such a good picture of how relationships are. God intended that relationships would be such a source of real blessing, real life, that enhance our life, bring so much color and beauty and variety. And yet, our enemy and God's adversary, Satan himself, knows that the very same potential exists for them to be a source of so much hurt. And just like I was in that moment where I was just petulant, where I was just full of rage, I couldn't even remember what I was angry about, and I just went and destroyed this thing that my sister really treasured. In much the same way, Satan seeks to destroy that which is precious to God, that which God really, really values, that which he intends to impart life to us. Because his ultimate desire, his ultimate design is that he wants to get back at God. But here's the encouragement, by the way. Just as my sister painstakingly took time to restore that pot, God can and is able to restore that which is completely broken. He can, and he can restore that which has completely lost hope. I was reading a couple of days ago Joseph's story, really sad story of these brothers who were so jealous and so hateful of their brother that they decided, we just have to get rid of him. And initially they thought they would kill him, and then the eldest thought maybe that's not such a good idea, and then they decided to sell him off, and they thought that was it, that they'd be done with it. And yet, even in that horrible circumstance, in that horrible situation, Joseph's words as he was looking back after he had been reconciled to his brothers when he was in Egypt, he said these words, that which the enemy intended, that which was intended for harm, God has turned it around for good. God can do the same in your life if you entrust your life to Him. He can turn that which has potential for so much harm and bring even blessing. He is capable to bring beauty even out of the ash heap, Isaiah said. He can bring joy from a place of mourning and sadness. That is the God that we serve. Anyhow, so God's heart for relationships. Why are relationships so central to who we are? I believe it is because we have been made in the image of God. We cannot run away from that. If you're a human being, you've been created to express something, and God is relational. He says in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26, let us make man in our image. So there was three of them. They were having a discussion and they were chatting, and they said, let us make man to express who we are in our image. And because God is relational, we too are relational. We cannot run away from it. In fact, the worst form of punishment that you can give to somebody, we were talking about this last Sunday at church, is to confine them to solitary confinement. You know, that's what they did to Nelson Mandela. That's what they do to criminals. That's what they do to people in prison. Sometimes to try and really treat them horribly is to punish them. Maybe it's to confine them, isolate them, cut them off from every form of relationship that there could possibly be. We have been created for relationships, and without relationship, literally we die. Relationships impart life to us. They imparted life at the beginning of our life, and they continue to impart life to us as we continue along the journey of life. And sadly, that same door, as I was saying, can be used for the other side. It can be used to impart destruction and pain and heartache. Consequently, there are, I believe, two types of relationships. There are godly relationships, there are ungodly relationships. So just a really quick brief look at those two types of relationships. Most of the relationships that we will experience will be a mixture of both. We'll see characteristics of both. But here are characteristics, I believe, of godly relationships. I'll quickly whiz through these. Number one, godly relationships are based on trust. And trust, I believe, has to be earned, not assumed or presumed. I would advise anybody before entering into relationships to ask, is this person trustworthy? Can I trust? Have they demonstrated to me a trustworthiness before I begin to really invest myself in this relationship? You know, Jesus said, do not cast your pearls among the pigs, lest they trample on them. Next, godly relationships are about mutual edification. They're about building each other up. You know, they're not about taking away from the other person, but there's this aspect in which you want to impart to you. You want to build the other person. You want to build each other up, and you're constantly thinking, what can I do today that will really bless the other person, build them up, enhance them? Godly relationships are about that respecting of that freedom of choice. This idea that you recognize the other person has the freedom of choice. You know, they can choose, and maybe they might choose even to reject me. I've got to be willing to respect that. When God put Adam and Eve in the garden, He gave them two trees. One tree would be a tree of life, which He wouldn't have minded if they ate of. But one tree was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God gave them a very specific instruction: do not eat of that tree, otherwise you will die. And in that existence that Adam and Eve had in the garden, day by day, they had a choice. And God gave them that freedom to carry on that intimate relationship with Him or to reject Him. You cannot really have genuine relationship unless there's that freedom of choice. Godly relationships are about that respecting of boundaries, I believe. This idea that you know where you end and where the other person begins, and that you do not trespass on that which belongs to the other person. You do not encroach without permission on that which belongs to the other person. This idea that I will not come into your house unless I am invited. I will not come into your heart unless I am invited. I will not go and start rummaging myself through your diary unless I'm invited. I will not look at your precious things unless I am invited. That respect of boundaries, that's an important aspect of godly relationships. Godly relationships, I believe, are to do with patience and a desire to forgive. This recognition that actually we are imperfect. There is no perfection in us, and so we will make mistakes and we will potentially hurt other people. And if we want them to be merciful to us and to forgive us those moments when we act out of our imperfections, we too ought to be willing to extend that same mercy and patience and forgiveness towards them. You know, Jesus said, treat other people as you would that they would treat you. Godly relationships are to do with being gracious. You know, exercising grace, expanding grace. Grace is to do with blessing the other person despite their undeservedness. You know, it says in Romans chapter 5 verse 8 that while we were still sinners, in other words, in our rebelliousness, in our sinfulness, Christ died for us. So it's like nothing we did to deserve it. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And so godly relationships, I believe there's an aspect of godly relationships where it's about being willing to extend grace, where it's a willingness to say, maybe I want to bless this person, even though maybe today they haven't done anything to bless me. I will just bless them regardless. Or maybe even when they're undeserving, maybe they might have treated me badly, but you know what? I will just send them a card to say, hey, I appreciate you. That's godly relationships. Godly relationships are about a willingness to listen and be heard. This idea that actually people might have different views to yourself. You know, I want to encourage you, do not just surround yourself with people who see the world the way you see it. That's what happens in cults. They just surround themselves with people who see they surround themselves. In fact, Paul talks about this when he's talking to in the book of Timothy about those who like to just have teachers who will tickle their ears. They just want those who will tell them things that will entertain them, things that they like to hear. Instead, be willing to surround yourself with people who maybe will confront you about things about yourself that maybe are not good. Maybe who see life differently to the way you see life. You know, Jesus, when he was picking his disciples, he actually picked them from opposite spectrums of society. For example, he picked Matthew, who was a tax collector, somebody who'd sided with the colonialists, with the Romans, somebody who had fetched money, collected taxes on behalf of the Roman oppressors. And yet in that same group, he picked Simon, who was a zealot, somebody who absolutely hated the Romans, who was willing to die in rebellion to the Romans. And yet he put the two of them together in the same group and he said, hey, this is my discipleship group. And so they had a challenge. They had to be willing to listen to the other person and be heard. That's what godly relationships are all about. Godly relationships are about that ability to respect and honor each other. And respect is a lot to do with value, I believe. You know, you respect that which you value. You know, if you don't value something, you won't respect it. And so being able to hold somebody in high esteem, being able to hold somebody in that sense that they're precious to you, that you cherish them, that respect and that honoring is part of godly relationships. Godly relationships are about that whole thing of sharing that experience of life together. You know, it's part of the marriage covenant. It's the couples will say often in sickness and in health, in poverty and in wealth, in richness and poverty or whatever. In other words, whatever comes my way, whatever comes our way in life, we will stick together. And I believe there's an aspect of godly relationships that's to do with that sharing of life's experience together, whether you're down or whether you're up, that you're going to be together and you're going to be for each other despite what's going to come your way. It's not this sense of, I'll only be, yay, rooting for you when life is going good, and then when things are going bad, I'm like, I don't know you, you don't want to know you. In fact, in the book of Romans chapter 12, verse 15, Paul, writing to the Romans, says to them basically, weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. In other words, don't just sort of be a friend in good seasons, in good times. There's a beautiful proverb that just come to mind that says there's a brother who was born for that moment of despair. A brother who was born for that moment of real anguish. And you know, it's such a precious thing. I've been in my life, experienced moments when I've been really at rock bottom. And then in those moments, very often, you will discover those that are the true friends, those that genuinely are for you, and those that are just interested in what you can give in that moment. I believe godly relationships are to do with giving. They're to do with this sense of being selfless, not self-centered, this sense of being generous. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, and giving is part of who God is, and within the context of relationship, it can only be godly if there's this mutual giving of one to another, this mutual sense of generosity one to another. The heightened form of that is expressed, I believe, in marriage, where actually husband and wife give of themselves through that act of sexual union. Godly relationships are to do with humility, has to do with a willingness to admit when we are wrong. There are times we will get things wrong. Willingness to say thank you, perhaps. A willingness to be taught, that none of us know everything. That actually there's a willingness there to say, yeah, would you show me, teach me? Perhaps I don't have the full grasp of what I'm talking about here. You know, I was reading yesterday, actually, Exodus chapter 18. Moses, a really fascinating situation happens when his father-in-law comes and visits him after the children of Israel have been led out of the wilderness. And his father-in-law, I don't know for those of you what sorts of relationships you have with your in-laws, comes and tells him, as he sees Moses sort of adjudicating and judging all the Israelites sort of from morning to evening. And Jethro, his father-in-law, looks at this and says, you're doing wrong. What you're doing is absolutely wrong. You will wear yourself out. You and both the people you're trying to help, you will end up just tiring yourself out. And you know, Moses in that moment doesn't sort of stop and say, who's this person I've just led a whole army, a million people out from Egypt through the wilderness. Who is he to come and tell me how to sort of do things? Moses is not like that, but rather in humility, Moses actually listens to the advice of Jethro, and that ends up working out for his own good. So humility, a willingness to admit when we get things wrong or right. Godly relationships are, I believe, to do with honesty. You cannot really have godly relationships where there is no honesty. There's got to be honesty. There's got to be truthfulness. You know, I'm reminded here of a situation of a secretary who the phone rang and a client the other end, somebody who the boss didn't really like and wasn't in the mood to speak to. And so the secretary kind of wanting to transfer it to the boss, wanting to transfer the phone to the boss, sort of reaches out to the boss and says, you've got so-and-so on the line and he wants to speak to you now. And the boss says to the secretary, tell them I'm not in. And the secretary, being a Christian, being a devout Christian, turns around and says to the boss, I'm sorry, I can't lie. That's against who I am. And the boss gets really furious with the secretary, says, just for goodness sake, it's just nothing to it. Just tell them that I'm not in, for goodness sake. And the secretary turns around and says to the boss, you know, if I lie to this client, then there's nothing really to stop me lying to you. Sort of mic drop moment, really, as the boss in that moment is sort of stopped in his tracks and says, okay, fine, I'll speak to them. But it is true, for there to be godly relationships, it's really important that there be this honesty and truthfulness, that there be even accountability, that we're willing to be accountable and honest. One of the things I say to myself when I started out on my job a couple of years ago, I said to myself, I will be honest to my employers. I will be honest and truthful to them. And it is something I believe that employers really appreciate when their employees are honest, even when things are really bad, even when their employees really muck up and mess up. I can remember somebody saying how on their first day, because I happen to work in the field of IT, this friend was recounting a story of how on their first day at a particular job, they were given a very senior IT role working for a council here in the United Kingdom. And they did something that managed to bring down the whole IT network on their very first day in this job. And they went and confessed to their boss. And I struggled to think what it would have been like if they tried to hide it or cover it up, if they wouldn't have been honest to their boss. And so I'm sure their boss really valued and appreciated their honesty. And certainly in that instance, their honesty was like the starting point at which they could begin to fix the problem. Okay, what exactly did you do? And then they honestly told them, I've done X and Y and Y. And then that way they were able to get to the bottom of what the issue was and fix it. So honesty, truthfulness, really important aspects to godly relationships. And then this last one I've got here is self-control. Godly relationships are, I believe, about self-control. Again, here I remember a situation. I remember a story of a lady I worked with once who went through a series at a time in her life when she would be quite short-tempered, and she would often come to us gloating about how she'd given somebody a piece of her mind, basically how she just poured her rage out at somebody in a moment of uncontrolled anger. And she would be quite proud of herself. In this moment, I was able to give them a piece of my mind. And I remember thinking that was not a very godly thing. And you could see the effect it had on those that were around her. And one of the effects it had was that people kind of distanced themselves from her because they felt this wasn't somebody they could really trust. And so self-control actually promotes relationship. Being able to stop and think before you speak, for example, or stop and think before you express that rage can be a really good and godly thing. It's not to say, by the way, that sometimes there is a rightful place for people to express anger when they've been hurt, so that the other person knows that actually their behavior has had an impact on them. We are not to be just kind of this emotionless sort of robot, but nevertheless, I believe self-control is an important thing because it allows us to gauge, is it going to be constructive for me to be able to respond in such a way in this relationship? And that way, you can actually enhance the relationship, can be a mutually blessing thing rather than a destructive thing. So that's godly relationships for you. Ungodly relationships, what are they characterized by? Very quickly, you have selfishness, I believe. There's this sense that actually it's just all for me. Self-centeredness, I'm the important person in this relationship, and I need to be the important person. It's narcissistic behavior. That's very ungodly. Pride, I believe, as well. Pride is one of the things that Satan, it's one of his chief characteristics, really. I've come across relationships where it's been communicated to me very clearly that the person has said, I am the important person in this relationship. I am the important person, the one that you need to listen to. My way is the right way. I am always right. My view or my opinion, I don't know if you've ever come across people who say, my opinion is the important one. Your opinion is not that important. That's a really ungodly relationship. If you're in a relationship like that where your opinion is subservient to somebody else's opinion because they feel they're more important than you, I would suggest that is an ungodly relationship. Ungodly relationships are where there are lies, where there is a lack of honesty. If somebody is being deceitful to you, maybe they're being one person to you, maybe they're being nice before you, but actually to their family they're being horrible, they're being something else, and so they're being deceiving in a way. They're not being honest with you. That is ungodly, I believe, where people tell you blatant lies. They cover up things. Where were you? I was at work, when really maybe they were at the pub or they were seeing somebody. lying can be a very it's like we often lie to try and cover up, because we think when we lie it somehow helps us to somehow separate ourselves from the shame or the guilt of the moment. But actually it doesn't do anything. The guilt and the shame still remain. The things that we did and their consequences will still live on, and all it does is it opens up the door to a lot of hurt and pain. So ungodly relationships, they will involve lying. Betrayal, speaking about lies, you can't miss out the whole aspect of betrayal. Betrayal is this sense that actually you trust somebody and then they let you down. They sort of disregard the trust that you put in them. Thinking here, for example, of Judas, who Jesus really trusted and trusted with a lot. Judas saw all the miracles. He saw Lazarus being raised from the dead. He saw he himself was party to miracles. When Jesus sent out the disciples and he sent them out in Luke chapter 10, they went out casting out demons and doing amazing miracles, healing people's diseases. Judas was amongst that number. Jesus really valued and entrusted Judas with a lot, and yet Judas didn't hold that relationship in the same regard and was willing consequently to betray him. Betrayal is where there is trust that has been broken because somebody hasn't valued that trust that you impart to them or that you place upon them. Ungodly relationships are about where there is a lack of forgiveness. Instead, there is condemnation. You always do this. That pointing of the finger. Isaiah 58 talks about that fast that is godly, that actually God says, if you put away the pointing of the finger, that wicked pointing of the finger, that accusing, that blaming, you're always doing this, you're always doing this, you're always wrong, you're always this. That is ungodly relationships. That's what Satan does, by the way. The Bible describes him as the accuser of the brethren, who accuses God's people day and night. He doesn't stop accusing, just keeps accusing. And that is not what God's like. Ungodly relationships are about that resentfulness. Instead of there being respect, where you respect somebody, you resent them. You're like even maybe despising them. You're like, you look down on them. They're like not worthy to be seated in the same place as you. That's what ungodly relationships are. And resenting somebody can be subtle. It can be where you resent their emotions, what they feel about something, or where you resent their views, their perspective on something, and you just look down on it, you just discard it. You're like, not really that important. One of the things I try and do as a pastor with my congregation, from the youngest to the oldest, I try as much as I can to value and to respect their views. I try and listen to them. I try and value and really cherish what they say, even though sometimes what they say might be seemingly not that important. But there's something about valuing somebody when you listen to them, and when you resent them, when you resent what they say, when you resent or even despise what they feel. I don't care what you feel. What you feel is of no consequence to my life. That is such a hurtful and a painful thing for somebody to go through. That brings me on to this next thing, really, that ungodly relationships are about abuse. Very often there will be abuse. Abuse, the best way I can describe it, is the misusing of something. Something was created to be used in a particular way. For example, God created us as human beings for the context of relationship. And then abuse is where you come along and you use that which God created for your own purposes, for your own gratification, maybe, for your own ends, maybe for your own feeling of prowess, that you can feel powerful, for your own valuing of self. Abuse is a horrible thing, and it's something that's destructive to human beings, really. So that's another characteristic of ungodly relationships. If you see there's abuse, even in the most subtle forms, there can be spiritual abuse between maybe a pastor and the congregation, where they sort of expect of the congregation things to be done that are outside what the Bible expects. Or even it can be the other way. I've seen situations certainly where congregations manipulate and control and abuse even their pastor. Which brings me to the next bit, really, where there's an ungodly control and manipulation, ungodly relationships. You'll find there will be that manipulativeness, that sense of, oh, do this for me once, darling. That way I'll know that you really love me. I was reading actually in the book of Genesis, as you can tell, I'm reading the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus. I was reading not long ago how Abraham said to Sarah, this way I'll know that you really, really love me. If anybody asks you who you are, just tell them that you're my sister and that I'm your brother. In other words, don't tell them the truth. That way I'll know that you really, really love me. You can see that manipulativeness on Abraham's part. Manipulation is an aspect of ungodly control and ungodly disregarding of somebody's freedom of choice that actually can be quite hurtful. It goes counter to that freedom of choice, that rather than leaving somebody the freedom to be able to choose, you try and somehow manipulate them so that they choose what you want. In its worst form, really, it can end up as witchcraft, because witchcraft is none other than that where you choose to really control somebody's choices, somebody's life, somebody's behavior, somebody's pathway even in life. That's why it's a horrible thing. Ungodly relationships are characterized by a lack of self-control. I can do whatever I want, behave the way I want, where I'm just petulant, like me with my sister in that moment, where I was just really angry at her and just went and destroyed everything. And that is a characteristic, by the way, of our enemy. He's very lacking in self-control. Sometimes he'll just act out of a fit of rage and do things without thinking. Ungodly relationships are very often to do with that disregard for somebody else's feelings, for that lack of respect for their choices. I've already mentioned that. When we disregard somebody's feelings, it can be really awful. It can be really painful to them. That unwillingness to listen to them. It's such an important thing, being able to listen to somebody, even if maybe you might not agree with them, being willing to listen to them. That is so important. That's what Jesus is like. It says in Isaiah chapter 1, God says to the children of Israel, regardless of the fact that they were really rebellious and idolatrous and just sort of didn't want to know, God says to them, come, let us reason together. Even though your sins were as red as scarlet, they will be as white as snow. Come, let us reason together. Let us reason together. That willingness to listen. You can see God is saying, let me hear what you've got to say, and then I'll tell you what I've got to say. That willingness to reason, so very important. And it's such an important thing, I believe, to parents. In that moment when you're correcting your children, by the way, to be willing to listen to them. Let them express themselves. Don't just tell them, give them a piece of your mind and just tell them, you jolly well listen to what I'm going to say because I'm your parent and that's that. Sometimes there's a rightfulness in doing that, but actually you see God in Isaiah chapter 1 saying, come, let us reason together. Let us reason together. Be willing to listen to your children and maybe hear from them. Maybe there's a reason why they're behaving the way they're behaving. Lack of accountability. That's another aspect of ungodly relationships. Very often things happen in the secretive place. In that place where actually you don't have to take responsibility for your choices. You can just enjoy. You can just do things secretly. Lack of accountability leaves you very vulnerable, by the way. Because when you just do things without your loved ones being able to tell you that what you've done is wrong. It's one of the things we were saying on Sunday. None of us has 20/20 vision. None of us has 20/20 vision. We all have blind spots. And accountability gives us the opportunity through which people can point out our blind spots and say, by the way, this thing you're doing is going to lead to your destruction. It's not a good idea. And so being able to be accountable to those that are around us, those that love us, those that are precious to us, really important thing. But if instead we want to do things in that secretive place with our this person that we really love, and we just want to go off and maybe go and elope and go off to Gretna Green and elope and do our thing secretly and do our thing without caring for what other people think. I've come across a number of situations where people have ended up experiencing a lot of hurt because there was no accountability. There was no accountability. They didn't sit there and maybe take something of the advice from those that would have been around them, that would have probably told them this is not such a good idea. Ungodly relationships are to do with that lack of honesty. We've already discussed that a bit to some degree. If there's no honesty, where things are just done secretly, where there's hatred even. I've seen situations where people actually stay in relationships despite the fact that one party is really hating of the other person, but the other person will probably defend them, maybe saying things like, oh, maybe this is God's will for me, or maybe God can bring good out of it somehow. It's sometimes a really good thing to have your eyes open and recognize that actually if you're in an abusive relationship where you're just hated, that actually maybe that's not good for you. Maybe it's time to seek advice and counsel from people who are wise and will be able to help you maybe come out of that situation. And this last one, I want to just talk about lust. Lust can be very destructive. Lust is a spiritual entity. It's actually a demon. And lust, in that moment of lust, we stop thinking. Esau came home hungry one day, really hungry, really famished. And he saw his brother Jacob making a soup. And this soup, the scent of it just wafting. And Esau was starving. Maybe he'd been out hunting for days and he'd not eaten for such a long time. He'd not caught anything. And in his hunger, in that moment of desperation, he said to Jacob, give me that soup, give me that soup, give me that soup. I want that soup so very desperately. And Jacob said, what will you give me in exchange? And Esau said, I'll give you anything, I'll give you anything. And in that moment of desperation, in that moment of lust, because that's what lust will do, in that moment of lust, you'll end up giving away bits of yourself that you will later on come to regret. You will later on come to regret. In that moment of lust, Esau gave away his birthright. Jacob said, give me your birthright and I'll give you some of the soup. And sure enough, Esau said, yeah, go on, forget about my birthright. Here's my birthright, you can have my birthright. And he gave him the soup. And later on, Esau came to weep and regret it bitterly when he realized what he'd lost in that moment. Lust will rob you. It will steal from you. And it won't steal just in that moment. It will carry on stealing. The effects of that stealing will carry on later on. That you'll be looking back to that moment and you'll recognize that was the moment when actually my life began to be deprived of certain things. When I was lustful and I refused to listen to advice. So avoid lust. Paul writing to Timothy said, flee youthful desires. Avoid lust. Embrace self-control. Exercise wisdom. There's practical things that you can do, and we'll come to those in a moment. Practical things that you can do to protect yourself from ungodly relationships, from these things that will do nothing but destroy you. And before we carry on, I'm just going to say that actually most of us, our relationships will have a little bit of ungodly and a little bit of godly. We need to be discerning and recognize when things are moving over into that ungodly realm, and maybe be willing to say, this is not going to be helpful for both of us. Or we need to be willing to acknowledge, maybe even when things are really going in the godly realm, and be thankful, rejoice and say, I really thank you because you do such and such for me. You're such a blessing to me. You are a good person to me. Be willing to recognize and discerning. When we see things are godly, yes, be thankful. But when we recognize things are ungodly, let us shun those things and be strong, and let us turn our backs from those things and be willing to be vigilant. And even, what comes to mind is Jesus telling Peter, get behind me, you Satan. Be willing to be really strong and say, get behind me. I'm not going to have any part of this. Not to say that Jesus didn't love Peter. He loved Peter. But he could see that the way things were going to happen in that relationship from what Peter was proposing, it would lead to something that would not be good. So, let us be willing. to be strong-willed, strong character, and reject things that are not going to be godly.